Good evening. Welcome to the first event of the 15th Annual Ray Warren Symposium on Race and Ethnic Studies. My name is Maya Hernández, and this is Jasmine Torres, and we are two of the 4 co-chairs for this year's symposium. Over the next couple of days, our community will explore the racialized dimensions of health and medicine in institutions, communities, and individual experiences. We will examine topics such as mental health, reproductive justice, environmental racism, and disparities in diagnosis and treatment, as well as experiences of people of color who are medical and healthcare practitioners. This symposium aims to expose structural inequalities and painful histories, while also underscoring the transformative ways that communities of color have developed strategies of healing justice as a form of resistance. Before we introduce our lovely keynote speaker, Professor Cooper Owens, there are a few housekeeping notes to attend to. First, please silence your cell phone, but feel free to live tweet during the presentation using our hashtag RWSympLC. You can find more information about our social media in the program, which you can pick up on the table outside. Be sure to follow along. We are recording tonight's presentation and will post the video to the symposium website in the coming weeks. Other audio or video recordings of the talk are not authorized. There will be time for questions and discussion after the presentation. Please raise your hand and wait for someone to come to you with the microphone. Even if you think your voice is loud enough for this room, please use the microphone, both for accessibility reasons and for our recording of the event. We will have some books for sale outside the council chamber after the presentation, and our speaker will be available to sign copies. You may also purchase symposium-related books in the bookstore until the end of next week. As part of the symposium this year, we are offering a healing justice practice space. A healing justice practice space is a place for community healing in relation to social justice work, and it centers Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, people with disabilities, and queer and trans folks. We are offering a variety of healing modalities centering BIPOC practitioners in an effort to uplift the survival tactics and resilience of these communities and to resist the co-optation and appropriation of our healing modalities. These services are free and geared towards BIPOC participants in the symposium. Please sign up with Maya. Where is she? There she is. Please sign up with Maya after the presentation tonight, or tomorrow and Friday at the table outside there for acupuncture, massage, and emotional support. All other spaces are drop-in. This event counts towards the Student Life Passport to Leadership program. If you are participating in that program, check in with Kim Brodkin. Kim, where are you? Over there. At the conclusion of the event, so she can sign the form and you can receive a stamp. We are excited for your engagement with the symposium over the next few days. Thank you and enjoy.
Tonight, we are thrilled to introduce keynote speaker Deirdre Cooper Owens. Deirdre Cooper Owens is an associate professor of history at Queens College, City University of New York. She is a proud graduate of Bennett College and Clark Atlanta University, 2 historically Black colleges and universities. Professor Cooper Owens is the recipient of several prestigious honors, including the University of Virginia's Carter G. Woodson Postdoctoral Fellowship and the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology Fellowship in Washington, D.C. Her dissertation on the origins of modern gynecology won the UCLA Mary Wollstonecraft Dissertation Award for Best Women's History Project. Deirdre Cooper Owens is recognized by an international audience, lecturing domestically and abroad to diverse communities. She has published essays, book chapters, and popular blog pieces on a number of issues that concern African American experiences. She has also made a number of appearances on national media outlets and as an expert on issues of race, medicine, and slavery in the US. Time magazine has deemed her one of the country's most acclaimed experts in US history. She is steadily and successfully working towards making history more accessible and inspiring for all. What makes Professor Cooper Owens' work particularly compelling is the way she addresses the painful histories of both Black slave women and Irish immigrant women and the inspiring contributions they have made to modern gynecology. Not only has she written about the historical role of Black women, but she has addressed topics such as toxic masculinity, rape culture, and racism. Her work encourages us to think about the women who have historically and are currently suffering the consequences of a society that privileges the voices of some while disregarding the rights of others. Her work is truly inspiring, and I'm sure her presentation tonight will be as captivating as it is eye-opening. So now, without further ado, we present to you Professor Deirdre Cooper Owens.
Okay, thank you so much. I am always shocked when I hear these introductions because according to my family members and my emotionally unstable cat, I'm really not that impressive. So it's always good to travel outside of New York to hear how impressive I am to other folk who don't know me. First, I'm from the South, so we always do, I give honor to all of these wonderful people who brought me here, but more especially the student workers who have done a fabulous job. Kim Brockton and Chelsea Jackson, Maya and Jasmine for your really, really wonderful introduction, and also our interpreters who are here, Rebecca and Layla. So typically I will read from a paper, but I am on New York time and I just don't feel like doing that. And so I have written an entire book about this project. So if I cannot speak extemporaneously, I am literally not worth the invite. So what I will do is first present to you a little genealogy. I know this might be, kind of old school for some of you, but although my glasses are off, I see some look as old as I am. So I know you are familiar with the miniseries Roots. Came out when I was very young, but it essentially tells the genealogy of Alex Haley's family from West Africa to British colonial America and then later the United States. And so I give my own kind of genealogical lineage of how this project came to be and why people are so interested in it. Because I have to be honest with you, as much as I love teaching about and researching the 19th century, a lot of people are just not interested in history of medicine projects. There are lots of projects around US slavery. And so what made medical bondage and the history of American modern gynecology really resonate with a 21st century audience? One would think it was my brilliance and masterful research, but at last it was not. So what happened? I wrote this dissertation, right, before it even became a book 10 years ago when I graduated from UCLA. And when you're writing a dissertation, you don't know what is going to happen. You don't know kind of what the political pulse will be. And so 10 years later, I am living in New York, kind of hoping and praying that the editors and reviewers will finally allow my book to be published. And so everything is a go. And I remember August 2017 receiving a number of texts and inboxes and emails. And I was told that there had been a kind of amplification around the James Marion Sims statue controversy. I don't know, how many of you have heard of James Marion Sims, known as the father of American gynecology? Anybody? A few, I see a few hands. So his statue, the image behind me, was, and I'm using past tense now, was on the easternmost part of Central Park in East Harlem. And it faced the New York Academy of Medicine. When Sims was living in the 19th century, he was a very prominent member of the New York Academy of Medicine. So by the 1930s, his statue was moved from Bryant Park, where all the fashion shows happened in Manhattan, to Central Park. And so I'm getting these emails in August and these text messages. Are you a part of this? Did you know about this? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, there was a flyer that went out, right, by the Black Youth Project 100, right? F, white supremacy. They give you the address, where, when, Saturday, August 19th. I don't know anything about this. People were asking me whether I was a member of Black Youth Project. I had to remind them that they kick you out at 30. I had passed that milestone many moons ago, so I could not have been a member if I wanted to. And so these young organizers were having a rally to really make very prominent their displeasure about the Sims statue still being in Central Park. So these women, and they were primarily women, identified, they come and they are really trying to highlight the lives of the enslaved women that James Marion Sims had experimented on for 5 years in Alabama. And we only know 3 of their names, Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. And so you can see, maybe, I don't know if you can see all the writing, but it says, in memory of Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, and 11 other unnamed women, the mothers of modern gynecology. So this is what really made the Sims statue controversy kind of take a life of its own. The woman in the head wrap, Jewel Cadet, was the vice president of the New York chapter of the BYP 100. And so she organized an artistic and symbolic protest. So she and the other organizers were dressed as medical patients. They had paint splattered on the hospital gowns to obviously reflect blood, and it went viral, right? And so all of a sudden, I get an email the next day, and this is a Sunday, mind you. Remember, the protest was on Saturday, from my editor. We're going to release your book early because we're going to ride the Sims wave. It worked out for me. I was able to put my book literally in my tenure box the next week. So it worked out for me. And so I said, okay, I didn't know what happened. All of a sudden, I'm being called and asked, to talk about this. And so remember, I said this was done, 10 years ago when I graduated. And so now folk are seeing me as the foremost historian on James Marion Sims. And, I didn't play nice with the journalist. I said, my book is not about Sims. It's about these enslaved women. It's about these poor Irish immigrant women, but that's not what folk wanted to actually hear. And so I kept trying to talk about the activists who were doing the work. For instance, the East Harlem Preservation Society that was founded by Marina Ortiz, who is to my left, and Diane Collier, who was an early activist. She was the chair of the community board in East Harlem. And so these women, literally since 2007, 2008, had really been the ones putting in the work. Why were people so interested in this topic? Well, there was this tragedy that happened at UVA in Charlottesville, right? With a group of neo-Nazis who like to dress dapper and call themselves the alt-right, who protested the possible removal of Robert E. Lee's statue in Charlottesville, and someone died, right? And so all of a sudden you started to have student protests around the South primarily to remove these Confederate statues. So what does James Marion Sims have to do with this? He was not a Confederate soldier. And New York is far removed from the South, right? It was not a part of the Confederate States of America. But what really happens is, right, all of a sudden you have the North implicated in this American kind of, history and, kind of memory project in some ways around the kind of culpability of who's really responsible for U.S. slavery. And no region's hands were clean. So a few months later, right, after all of the protests, April 17th rolls around, 2018, and I start to, and this is the thing, in New York, we knew that the statue was going to be removed. It was the only one that Mayor de Blasio and the New York City Parks Commission decided would be removed in the 5 boroughs. So once again, I'm preparing. It was a Tuesday, I remember this. I'm preparing to go teach my classes. My phone is blowing up. I'm getting text messages, getting emails, Facebook, inbox messages, tweets. And so I'm like, what is going on again? And I'm just like, this damn Sims continues to haunt me because it was my birthday. So I thought people were calling to wish me happy birthday. They were calling to see if I had gotten the Sims statue removed. And I'm like, no, I was a lone researcher. I didn't have anything to do with it. But the wonderful thing that then happened was I was able to provide historical context for this really contentious political moment. And so I'm really grateful for these kinds of opportunities to do what historians do best, right? We give this kind of broad information, but what we're able to do is fill in some of the gaps with precise and factual information based on the records that we have, right? Facts can change, right? Facts can change. But based on what we do have, that's what we provide at the moment. So James Marion Sims' statue was removed on my birthday, and it is to be transported to Greenwood Cemetery. That's where he's buried in Brooklyn. There are now protests by members of that Brooklyn community who don't want the statue in the cemetery. So we don't know what will actually happen. So a part of my issue as a historian of slavery, a historian of medicine, and the kind of long 19th century is the ways in which this issue has been framed, right? Perfect example, I was interviewed in April 2017 by Lauren Saucer, who works for South Carolina's largest newspaper, the Post and Courier, and the name of the title, right, of the article, Savior of Women or Medical Monster, the fraught legacy of South Carolina's most infamous physician. And so here I am trying to explain that these either or binary frameworks just don't work, right? People are not just either or. And if you actually understand the role of a slave owner and a slave-owning physician, you'll see how complicated it is, but also how false that kind of headline is. And people don't necessarily expect that response from someone who looks like me, right? So although I write about Irish people and I have an Irish name, Deirdre Cooper Owens, I'm not really Black Irish, right? And so they kind of are shocked that this woman who's housed in this body is saying things that goes against the way that Sims has been framed. And I'm like, you just have to stay with me for a little bit and I'll explain, right? And so it boils down to, was James Marion Sims, the father of American gynecology, right, as he was called by his peers after his death, was he actually exceptional in his treatment of enslaved women, right? There are two camps. So his critics call him a butcher. He mangled enslaved women's reproductive parts and later did the same work on Irish immigrant women. But for the most part, the poor Irish immigrant women who he worked on in the North have kind of been excised from the story. And then you have those who defend him, and they defend him vigorously. They say he was benevolent, he took care of these enslaved people, he housed them, he clothed them, he made sure that their reproductive functions were working for those 5 years, and he did this out of the compassion that he had for these women, right? And he's actually a hero. And so as a historian, once again, I am trying to explode that kind of binary. And what I'm saying is Sims, as a 19th century figure, actually inherits a cultural practice based around scientific racism, as we would call it in the 21st century, right? But he's not unique. In fact, he's very ordinary. The only thing that was unique about Sims was his ability to have a sustained record of success with his surgical repairs, right? And so I start off with talking about Georges Cuvier, right? Not American, in fact, was French. And I talk about his work with Sarty Bartman, who I'll discuss in a few minutes. And then I mention Ephraim McDowell, a person most people have not heard of, right? He's known as the father of the ovariotomy. I'll talk about him as well. But John Peter Matar, an early pioneer of vesicovaginal fistula, which I'll explain, and I'm glad we've all eaten. So when I explain that, just make sure that you put your drinks and your snacks down. But known as the father of American plastic surgery. And then lastly, Francois-Marie Provost, right, who was known as the father of the C-section. All of these men did pioneering gynecological work well before Sims did. And so a part of my critique is Sims's exceptionality in our conversation around medical racism is really indicative of the ways that I think these kinds of conversations need to be complicated. Because I've always said this, if we implicate Sims, right, and I'm not advocating that we don't implicate Sims, but you must implicate all of them, right? Because Sims wasn't doing anything that was different than all of these men who came before him across the Atlantic Ocean and in the continental United States. So let's begin first with why maintaining the reproductive health of enslaved women was so important. So now I'm going to put on the professorial hat for just a moment. Although the U.S. Constitution does not at one time mention the word slave or slavery, we know it's in there because in 1807, the international slave trade was deemed illegal. So 1808 in the United States becomes the first year that slave owners are now really concerned with trying to increase the natural production of their slave labor force. And so when you start to look at slave management journals, and sometimes my students are like, what? And I was like, they were businessmen, right? And they had journals. And so most of those slave management journals, the largest sections, even the letters to the editors, they would often talk about slave health. How can we make our slaves healthy? And a large portion of that conversation and that discourse was around the reproductive labor, but also health of enslaved women. And why is this important, right? If we go a little bit, farther back in time, during the colonial era, in British colonial America, but you could pick any European colonial space, but British colonial America is important because in the 18th century, a man named Robert Beverly in Virginia writes, essentially he writes a kind of manifesto. And it talks about very explicitly the difference between slaves and servants. And so it was meant for white English men and women who were contemplating coming to this English colony, right? And they had heard all kinds of things, right, about angry warlike Indians and, these kind of fantastical people, who didn't quite look like them. And so Robert Beverly is very explicit in saying, right, servants have a finite period of time. Slaves are Negroes, and they are slaves for life. And then he says, even their posterity. And then this is where Beverly's 1705 document literally turns English law on its head. He says that slaves inherit the condition of their mother through partus sequitur ventrum, right? The child follows the womb. This never happened before, right? Children always inherited the status of their fathers. But all of a sudden you find in colonial America literally a turning upside down of English law. And so why would children inherit the condition of the mother? Because paternity didn't matter. Enslaved women got pregnant by enslaved men, by freemen of color, by Indian men, by white men, right? Just a few months ago, this is like the thing that kind of just keeps on. I'm like, my goodness, what else are they going to find about good old Mr. Jefferson? When I was a postdoc, we were told to call Thomas Jefferson Mr. Jefferson at UVA. And so Mr. Jefferson not only, had all of these children with his slave Sally Hemings, right? But archaeologists just discovered another bedroom that was literally adjacent to Thomas Jefferson and his wife's bedroom that Sally lived in, right? So she wasn't even in the outhouse. He built a bedroom for her. And after his death, to conceal the relationship, right, people walled it off. And so here she had 5 children by Thomas Jefferson, an ambassador, right? The author of the Declaration of Independence, the 3rd president of the United States, and none of those children could inherit the condition of the father because of this law, right? And so it becomes extremely important for those invested in an economically successful labor system to make sure that Black women are giving birth in healthy ways and producing children that live, right? So this is really important, and it provides context, right? So how do these men, right, all of these men I have listed, how do they learn to treat enslaved folk? Sarty Bartman, has anybody heard of her? Not you, because you're from Johannesburg, so you stop. Not you. Anybody else? Okay. So Sarty Bartman, most people know her either Sarah Bartman, the anglicized version of her name, or the Hottentot Venus, right? Hottentot, a very derisive name, a pejorative term for Black people from South Africa. Venus, it was this way that often slave owners, really, whites who were anti-Black, would give these names that were attached to European royalty, or they were attached to these European ideals of beauty, virtue, and then they would give it to a person who did not, in their minds, represent this at all. So if you all have ever read the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vassa, right? He was the first formerly enslaved person to write a memoir that served as an abolitionist tract. Gustavus Vassa was the name of Swedish royalty. This was seen as a joke because he was an African-born slave, right? Sarty Bartman seen as the Black Venus, right? Those things seem like oxymorons. And so Sarty Bartman was a Khoi woman in South Africa, 17 years old, young woman at the time, about to get married. And so she did what people do to this day. She was having a community celebration, right, to really celebrate and commemorate this moment in her life when she was about to marry and become another kind of woman, right, older, more mature. And as she's celebrating, she is literally snatched by these 2 Englishmen. Now, this is the thing. If you know anything about South Africa, it borders the Indian Ocean, right? So she's brought to the Atlantic Ocean. And this is why I often tell people I wear the title revisionist historian proudly, because the older history that actually needs to be revised with accurate information said, well, Sarty just left with these 2 men. I'm like, wait. So at this point, South Africa was colonized by the Dutch, so she did not speak English. She probably did not know that there was an ocean called the Atlantic. And see, she certainly probably had not heard of England. And who leaves a bachelorette party where they are turning up, getting lit? See, I listen to young people, right? All of this stuff, to go on a boat across another continent and ocean. So, I know revisionist historians, it's supposed to be a pejorative term, but I wear mine proudly, right? And so here she ends up in England, and she is literally made to perform, be a spectacle. She's put on display. She's partially nude often, or she's made to wear flesh-colored clothing, and people are fascinated with Sarty Bartman. Fascinated, largely because she has a big butt and large buttocks, right? I lived in South Africa for a few months. She looks like many South African women. I'm from South Carolina. She looks like a lot of women in my family, right? I mean, she has a big butt, that's it. And yet it is now medicalized as a condition. Steatopegia, the condition of having enlarged buttocks, right? It's now seen as an abnormality and a pathology, right? And this is in the late 18th century. And so what begins to happen, you start to see that Sarty Bartman, right, represents a kind of exemplar, a model of how Europeans, especially European learned men, are thinking about Black biological difference, right? And so Sarty Bartman kind of fades from the scene for 2 years. She emerges again in Paris. By this point, the telltale signs of a hard life have become pretty evident. She has become a heavy drinker. She has entered into sex work. She has a number of sexually transmitted diseases. And she's your age, literally. She's a woman who is in her early 20s. And so she is now under the care of the National Museum of Paris. And Georges Cuvier is probably the most well-respected and renowned natural scientist, a natural historian as they were called, at the museum. And he is interested in Sarty Bartman, right, because of her enlarged buttocks, but also this belief that somehow Hottentot women have different genitalia. And he wants to see if she has what was called a Hottentot hood, right, or an elongated labia. And so you can see the ways that she enters into the kind of Western imagination from this illustration from a French periodical, right? You can see the man behind her. There's this kind of fascination. You see someone else who looks disgusted, kind of disturbed. A woman who is examining even her knees, right? And the man kind of to my far right who is looking at her with a monocle, right? She becomes a specimen, right? And so Cuvier is, he's kind of exhibiting all of these behaviors and all of these kind of emotional responses and even intellectual responses to Sarty Bartman's alleged difference. And so he is trying to examine her, and she's not an easy patient to examine. He tries to bribe her with candy, with money, all kinds of things. He keeps her in the menagerie, right? And for many people who, like me, I would hear that as a child. I heard of the play, The Glass Menagerie, but I never knew what it meant, right? And back then, it's where you kept animals and plants, right? So she's kept essentially with animals and plants. And so she eventually dies at the age of 25. Cuvier dissects her cadaver. She is skinned. Her skeleton is put on display. Her genitalia is cut and pickled, is preserved and put into a bell jar. And she dies in if I'm not mistaken, 1801 or 1803. But it's the very start of the 19th century. Her genitalia was displayed in the National Museum of Paris until 1974, until it was lost. Her skeletal remains were not sent back to South Africa until the 21st century, right? This is important, and you'll see why, but it literally sets up the ways that men in America, primarily the South, because this is the region that has the kind of pioneering gynecological surgeries that are happening and treatments, how they begin to treat enslaved women. So we now move just a few years after Bartman's death to Kentucky to talk about a man, Ephraim McDowell, who I didn't know, I had never heard of him until I started this research project. So Ephraim McDowell was actually born to a pretty prominent family. His father was a lawmaker in Virginia. His mother, as any elite woman of her class, she worked at home. They moved west to Kentucky. And they settled in Kentucky in the 18th century, the late 18th century. Ephraim McDowell then became interested in medicine. And so at this point, you didn't have to go to medical school. That was certainly an option, but you didn't have to go. You could apprentice. So he and a friend decided they wanted to apprentice with the local doctor in a little town called Danville, Kentucky, very small place. So the local doctor was unfortunately also known as the town's drunk. And so they are apprenticing for this man, and one day they learn of an enslaved man's death. Now this is the thing, why are they so interested in this enslaved man's death? Medical students and apprentices could not touch, they could not physically examine patients. And so Ephraim McDowell and his colleague decide to rob the grave so that they can examine essentially perform an autopsy to learn about the anatomy, right, human anatomy on this this cadaver, right, of this late enslaved man. So they rob the grave, they perform the autopsy, but it's a small town. And I don't know how many of you have lived in a small town. I know I graduated from a high school that had, in my graduating class, 112 people. So there's always somebody looking, right? There's always somebody observing you. And there were people who observed Ephraim McDowell, steal this corpse. So a scandal breaks out. Ephraim McDowell and his colleague lie, and they blame it on the doctor that they apprenticed for, because the doctor was, a heavy drinker. So when the truth finally comes out, Ephraim McDowell's parents, they don't allow him to be punished. They, in fact, send him off to Edinburgh, arguably the best medical school in the Western world. So he goes to Edinburgh to escape condemnation in Danville, Kentucky, does not finish his medical course, but he comes back as a medical doctor and begins practicing medicine. The reason why we know of the father of the ovariotomy is he meets a white woman named Mary Todd Crawford, who has a distended belly. She is in extreme pain, and at first he thinks maybe she's pregnant. And she assures him she does not think she's pregnant. And so he examines her, and he surmises that perhaps she has a diseased ovary. And so he says something. Now, this is 1808. He says something to her and her husband that meant sure death. He says, "I'll have to operate, but cut your stomach. I'll have to make an abdominal incision." In 1808, there had been no successful case of an abdominal incision, right? You would die. She's so desperate. Her husband is so desperate, they agree to it. The townspeople find out. Now remember, this is a person known as old grave robbing Ephraim McDowell, right? So the townspeople are like, "No, you don't. You will not butcher this woman, right? You will not butcher this fine woman." So he then asks the husband and Mrs. Crawford to sneak into his home, which is also his medical practice, to be operated on Christmas morning, 1808. Because he figures everybody will be home or at church worshiping or, with their families, and he performs an operation, and Mrs. Todd Crawford lives. Not only does she live, she lives for decades. The woman dies in her 70s, right? So you would think Ephraim McDowell is like, "Yes, I'm gonna write about this." He doesn't. But he finds more cases of women who have diseased ovaries. And he performs experimental research on them, experimental trials. All of the women he located in Danville were Black, most of them enslaved. One or two might have been free women of color. 9 years later, he finally publishes his findings in a medical journal. One would then think the medical world would praise this pioneering physician and surgeon. They, in fact, ridicule him, they lambast him. The Lancet, which is Britain's leading and really the world's leading medical journal, in fact, Dr. Johnson was so disturbed by what he thought were salacious lies by Ephraim McDowell. He said this, frontier doctor in the woods of Kentucky, well, of course he would cut negresses. They bear cutting with the same amount of pain as cats, dogs, and rabbits, meaning they wouldn't experience pain at all. And so he is literally he's not praised during his lifetime, right? It's only after his death that he is called the father of the ovariotomy by colleagues and medical students. Now, this is what was really interesting. And for any history majors, this is where I kind of had to approach the archives differently as a doctoral student. When I first ran across this, I thought, okay, this is interesting. Danville, Kentucky. How many Black people are there actually in Kentucky in the 21st century when I was doing research? So I'm like, how many could have been in Kentucky in the 19th century, especially the early 19th century? How would he find all of these people? Well, My father worked at the National Archives, so I used to do research in DC to go visit my family. I was all the way in Los Angeles. And I remember going to the National Archives and speaking with some of his colleagues, and I said, well, do we have census records for Danville, Kentucky? They said, we do. I literally then find, through primary sources and secondary sources, Danville, Kentucky in 1808 had a 4% black population that included free and enslaved people. I'm more astounded that he found 5 black women with diseased ovaries to experiment on in Danville, Kentucky, right? A town that still has a really small black population, but he does, right? And Mary Todd Crawford is literally the only white person that he experimented on. 2 of those black women, he wouldn't call it experimenting on Mary Todd Crawford, that's me using 21st century language, but that he operated on. The experimental trials, he lost 2 of those patients, right? So then this made me think about accessibility to vulnerable patient populations, but also the ways in which black women were essentially now, right, being treated, written about, thought of by medical doctors. Okay, I'm trying to find the clicker. Oh, here it is. So the next person, right? Now remember I said 1809 for Ephraim McDowell. He publishes the article 1817. 1830s, John Peter Matar, pioneer in obstetrical fistula surgery. This is where I now warn you to put down your drinks and your snacks. So obstetrical fistula is the contemporary term for a 19th century condition that was pretty common, vesico-vaginal fistula. Vesico is simply a medical term for bladder. Fistula means hole. So during these, these eras of kind of pre-anesthesia, when obstetrics and gynecology were just emergent medical branches, women would have protracted pregnancies, as they were called, for days, not just hours, days. So if you have someone who is in the throes of childbirth and it literally just stops, right? So there's day 1, day 2, day 3. Of course, you're going to call someone in beyond the midwife to try to, not exacerbate, but to try to have the fetus removed. So after the protracted pregnancy and the woman gives birth, typically to a stillborn baby, what happens is tearing, right? Because there's all of this friction that's going on. You're trying to remove something from your body. You're trying to expel it. So the friction that happens in the upper vaginal area creates a fistula or a hole. It could be microscopic, it could be gaping. And then what's exposed is the bladder, right? So you have these holes, you have the tearing in the vaginal area, and then in the vaginal vault, right, because the bladder is right here, urine fills, which creates incontinence. If the tearing is in the anus, it's incontinence in that area. It does not kill you, right? I've spoken with people and they say, well, I heard that the VVF could kill you, and I'm like, it doesn't kill you. But as you can imagine, these are women of childbearing age. There is ostracism by the community. These women often have a foul odor, a stench. There's infection. Obviously, if you are ostracized from your community, you are suffering from, back then they called it, melancholia, right, or depression. And so it is a really common condition. And so John Peter Matar, who was this pioneer in obstetrical fistula surgery, who lives in Virginia, becomes a leading gynecological surgeon and medical professor, becomes, in fact, the most prominent doctor at the Randolph-Macon College of Medicine. It's no longer in existence. But he then performs an experiment on an enslaved woman and a white woman. And the white woman who suffers from obstetrical fistula is repaired. The black woman is not. He literally continues an experiment on her for 8 years, and he cannot repair her. In the medical journal article that he writes, he exclaims in a moment of, really, he's frustrated because he doesn't understand why he can't repair this woman's condition. And so he writes, right, the condition could have been repaired had the negress not engaged in sexual intercourse, right? Now, just as Ephraim McDowell owned slaves, so did John Peter Matar. And they knew from personal experience that an enslaved woman can't say, nah, not tonight, right? They know this. How could she have stopped? What if she were married and it was an enslaved person that she loved, right, that she wanted to be intimate with? What if it was an overseer, a master, and she was forcibly made to engage in sexual intercourse, right? Because the body is not her own. And so in that moment of his frustration and transparency, but also honesty, right, it let you know the ways in which reproductive labor operated for Black women and white women, right, in the 19th century. That Black women did not have control of the reproductive labor that was required of them, that was forced upon them. So that's John Peter Matar. Remember, this is before James Marion Sims. James Marion Sims, this is the person everybody asks me about. They never ask me about the enslaved women or the Irish immigrant women. They always say this, so what do you think about the statue? And so I have to then explain to them, right, that it's bigger than the issue of the statue, right? Because the kind of legacy of medical racism that was in the era of Sims still, right, has a resonance for us today. And so this is where I'm able to explain exactly who Sims was. Unlike McDowell, unlike Matar, Sims was not born in an elite setting. He was born in the upcountry Lancaster, South Carolina, to a kind of middling level family. And Sims decided that he wanted to become a medical doctor, to the consternation of his parents, especially his father, who considered medical doctors at that time quacks. So he goes to the medical school in South Carolina. He is dissatisfied with the medical education there. And then he does, like many Southern young men, he goes up north to Philadelphia to the Jefferson Medical College, where he finishes. Returns home, sets up shop, gets married, has children. He has to kind of build himself up in the community. So he at first works with poor whites. He works on Negroes, but he did not use that word. He works on Jewish people. And so he is a prolific medical writer. That's the one thing about Sims. You know, he was not going to be an Ephraim McDowell where you wait 7 years to produce an article. And Sims is doing all manner of work, right? But none of it was focused on women's health care. So Sims is performing surgery on hair lips, much like Matar. Sims is doing some dentistry, some oral surgery. Sims is doing general practitioner work. And so his life changes, much like Ephraim McDowell, when a white woman, a Mrs. Merrill, comes to him in extreme agony because she had fallen off a horse. And her uterus literally turns upside down. She is in extreme pain. Remember, I said, male doctors don't typically examine women. So you'll sometimes open up these medical textbooks and you'll see these images of the male doctor like underneath a hoop skirt doing like this. They're not looking at women's bodies, particularly not white women's bodies. Let me scratch women, ladies, as they would say, white ladies' bodies, right? And so this woman comes and he has to beg her forgiveness because he has to examine her. And as he's examining her, he writes in his memoir decades later, because this happens in 1844, he says, I remembered from a course in medical school, a doctor said if you could open up the vagina wide enough, the rush of air pressure could revert the uterus. This is what he writes in his, and he did not mean it as a joke. Shame on you for laughing. So he writes this in his memoir. He opens her up, right? And all of a sudden he says she has relief. There's a sound that sounded like flatulence. She was so embarrassed, but she was relieved, and her uterus is turned right side up. But this was the interesting moment. During Mrs. Merrill's visit to be essentially, as they called it in the 19th century, fixed, there was an enslaved woman named Anarcha who was in his establishment, who suffered from vesicovaginal fistula. When she first came, and this is a thing that where the folk who see Sims as the hero, and they're like, he cared so much about these slaves that they came to him. I was like, you do know slaves needed passes, right? Like, you just can't say, oh, I think I'm gonna go to the doctor today because I don't feel well. It didn't work that way. Her owner, Tom Zimmerman, sent her to Mount Meigs, Alabama, to see if Dr. Sims could repair her of the vesicovaginal fistula. Upon immediate kind of smell, but also looking at her, he said, there's nothing I can do. In fact, I don't operate on women, right? I don't treat women. So he told her to wait because she lived in an even more rural part. You just wait here and then I can send you back or have someone fetch you to send you to your owner. But after this experience with Mrs. Merrill, he thinks, if I can just examine the vaginal area, perhaps I can fix, right, the fistula. I can repair the hole. I can suture it. So he takes 2 pewter spoons and he examines Anarcha. And he writes in his memoir, I saw as no man had seen before, right? Everything was right before me, as close as my nose. You all are laughing. I'm trying to tell you, this was not a comedy routine, y'all. This is 19th century medical writing. So he writes this. And the interesting thing, he then says, I canvassed the county for cases, right? So he literally gathers up about a little more than half a dozen enslaved women. We know the names of the other 2, Betsy and Lucy. So he gathers these women up, and as he writes, I then built a little hospital for myself, right? So this is an 1895 photograph of that hospital. Obviously, Sims had been dead by this point, and this was the Mount Meigs, Alabama establishment that Sims built for himself and these patients. This is where I have to, as a historian, remind them, Sims was not out hewing wood and chopping it. The enslaved folk were doing that because Sims was a slave owner and a physician. So the slaves built this hospital. It was then sold to one of Sims's former assistants, Nathan Bozeman, who continued the practice of working on enslaved women and then later free Black women in Mount Meigs, Alabama. And so this picture was taken in 1895. It's not as clear, but on the porch you'll see an elderly Black man, an older Black woman, and you'll even see a little Black child in kind of out in the yard. So you see that even in the era of freedom and emancipation, right, it's still a space where Black people are being treated, examined, hopefully healed. So he has this hospital built, as he says, for himself, and he then begins an experimental phase, right? We now know experiments are not new. Ephraim McDowell, John Peter Matar. If you read the first chapter of my book, you'll learn about all of these kinds of experiments from all of these men who are too numerous to name, right? So Sims, right, begins to experiment on these women. And this is also a moment where medicine becomes more scientific. So some of the language, right, and some of the practices of science is being infused into medical practice. And so what he does is he takes those 2 pewter spoons, and they then become the Sims speculum. If anyone has ever had a pap smear, right? It's the duckbill speculum, right? So it literally emerges. I'm a very fun patient when I go for my Well Women's annual exam. Well, what do you do? Actually, I'm a historian of medicine. Let me tell you about the things I know, right? Slavery was at the cause of it. I literally can make people run out of the room. So, I talk about the Sims speculum and how it literally, right, the first iteration, pewter spoons, he would have never done that on a white patient. In fact, Sims talks about in his later work how when white women who suffered from these gynecological conditions that caused them immense pain and agony, that he was so concerned about their fragility and the fact that they could not take the treatment that might have been too painful, he in fact would not even examine them for fear of causing them pain. And yet, in that little hospital that he built for himself, right, with his 2 surgical assistants. Nathan Bozeman is the name of one of them that we know. He literally invites, right, the most elite people in Mount Meigs, and then later he moves his practice to Montgomery. He, performs these public surgeries, right? These women are displayed, right, nude. And this goes on for 5 years until he is able to repair them. But there's a particular moment that happens, right, in that kind of 2.5-year, 3-year mark. And Sims writes about this and says that the community withdraws their support. His surgical assistants leave him. He's losing money. He has family members and friends who are concerned about his well-being because they're saying, you are failing. These women are not being helped. Just cut the cost, right? Send them back to their owners and just go back to your family and doing the kind of medical work, where you were successful. And he doesn't want to give up. So this is where the critics of Sims, right, have said, how could he be so callous? He then made those enslaved women patients work for him as nurses, right? As surgical assistants. They were his patients. How could he do that? And my question is always, what would an enslaved person have done otherwise? Guess what slaves did? In sickness or in soundness or health, as it was called then, they worked. They labored. He literally did what any other slave owner would require of his slave labor force. They were sick when they helped build that hospital, right? So when one enslaved person or 2 enslaved people were recovering, right, he had these enslaved women to assist, right? And so he did this for 5 years. And essentially, these women then learn all about this emergent medical branch of study called gynecology. Now, this is where, once again, as a doctoral student, right, as I'm thinking about this, the reigning belief is women are a subset, an inferior subset of men who are guided by their uteri, right, not their brains. So it's the uterus that guides women's thinking and logic. You then add on to that these are Black women, right? And Negroes are considered mentally degenerate, right? That they don't possess the kind of intellectual capabilities of the white race. Sims, who is considered the father of American gynecology, and after he finishes this experimental trial in 1849, by 1852, 1855, he is arguably one of the country's leading gynecologists, goes off to work on European royalty, the most elite members of society. But this is the rub. Sims teaches these so-called degenerate people the same skills he taught these white men who left him 2.5 years prior. This is what I call racial cognitive dissonance, right? So someone like Thomas Jefferson could write in Query 14 in his only book, Notes on the State of Virginia, that the reason that Negroes look the way they do is because the African woman chose to mate with the orangutan rather than her man. And yet here he was slipping into Sally's newly constructed bedroom right beside his. A Negro, right? So James Marion Sims, right, can be a slave owner and have these thoughts about Black people and yet teach them the very same thing that he taught men and on top of that, white men. Now, this is where I really started to kind of, really parse out the archives and to think a little more deeply about it in a different way. Once again, the revisionist history label I gladly accept, because I say we are to bring our experiences into the archives with us. The reason I told you I went to a really small Southern school in South Carolina is because it made a difference in my research. I go to the National Archives, and I'm from a place in South Carolina where it's a low country, and it's kind of the Gullah Geechee region. So most people look like me. My joke is always, and black people laugh uproariously, I thought I was light-skinned until I went to college, right? Because we look very, very West African and very dark. And so I knew in my little small town in the South that the few lighter-skinned black people who lived there were always related to the elite white people. It was an open secret, right? So in looking at the census of Sims, the other folk who wrote about him always looked at the census to see how wealthy he was. Oh, he owned or leased 17 slaves. So this meant his wealth equaled XYZ amount. I looked at the census in a different way. I thought, I wonder, what can the census tell us about enslaved people? The census didn't care about their names or anything like that. You'd be lucky to get an age sometimes. But by 1850, this is the moment where you start to have different classifications of Negroes. So as I'm going down the list and I'm counting, okay, how many males, right? Because the M and F, so it's female males. 5 males. Okay, how old are these males? 12 years and younger. So I'm like, okay, none of these boys could have been married, right? Or the father of any of the children, because they were children. So then I start to see, what are the ages of the childbearing women? There are 12 people left, about 8 or 9, right? Okay. But then there are, no, I take that, about 7, because some of them have been children. I then look, okay, how are these people classified? Wait, Negro, 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 M? Negro, 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 M? You know, so I see this one M. I go back. Who's the mulatto? The little girl who's the youngest person on the slave farm. Now, if any of you are interested in going to grad school, you better hold on to that information. I didn't let that one out until the book came out. So, I'm like, oh my God, is he, insert poorly, kind of a poor taste joke, but was he really the father of American gynecology? A census record cannot tell me this, right? Because that's the thing, the census record doesn't care about enslaved people. They care about the accounting of property, of movable chattel property, right? That's what chattel means, movable property. That's all they care about. But for me, this now creates another question I can ask, right? I have no clue who the father of this little mulatto girl is, but I do know it is quite normal, right? It's not outside the boundaries of normal behavior for an enslaver, right? For an overseer, really for any local white man to have access to a black woman's body. And this little girl's appearance was so markedly different from the 16 other Negroes on this slave farm that Sims owned or leased, that she was marked by the census taker as mulatto. Now I go back to the memoir, right? And then I start to do a chronology. Wait a minute, this little girl was born around the same time Sims writes about the white community withdrawing support. Do I have definite answers? No, but I certainly have questions around the chronology of these moments that you can ask. And now I can insert, right, an issue of biomedical ethics that clearly prompted some white folk to withdraw support from Sims, because Sims even intimates in his memoirs, right, that there had been whispers that perhaps he had been using these women like guinea pigs because they were not being healed. Now this is where, once again, I have to insert myself as the historian, and I tell people, because they're like, see, he was mangling their body parts. Time out. I told you slavery is perpetuated after 1808, not on the trade of bodies coming in from West and Central Africa. It's now predicated upon natural increase. And it's literally, right, residing within the womb of black women. So the one thing you want to preserve is black women's, as it was called, fecundity, right? Their ability to reproduce and reproduce often. So it would not be, right, in the best interest of Sims to butcher or mangle these enslaved women's reproductive parts. In fact, he wants to preserve it. And on top of this, notice I keep saying least. He says, I canvassed the county for cases. Sims has to enter into a contractual agreement to lease these enslaved women from the men who own them. And people are often shocked, what, they were leased? I'm like, you've heard of Frederick Douglass? He was leased. You heard of Harriet Tubman? First time she was ever leased at 6 years old. Leasing was quite common, right? And so all of a sudden, I now am thinking about this, right, in much more complicated ways. And I'm able to ask questions where you start to see the intersection of class and race, status, right? All of these things that are working in concert with each other and even against each other, right? And so for me, I then say the critique of Sims should not be based on a kind of misinformation around what slavery wasn't, right? But what slavery was. And so Sims, in this contractual agreement, has a legal binding requirement not to damage other men's property, which is why he would not want to intentionally damage these women's reproductive parts, because he wants to send them back, as he says, so that they can be fit for the duties of servants, right? So Sims finishes this experiment in 1849. The women are healed according to Sims. He sends them back to their owners. After a short bout of illness, he publishes On Vesico-Vaginal Fistula in 1852. 3 years later, his life changes. He moves to New York and opens up what he considers to be the first hospital for the treatment of women. It's called the New York State Hospital for Women. First sentence in my book, right? Once again, revisionist historian. I'm like, we have to be accurate and truthful. I'm like, the first hospital for women in the United States was in Mount Meigs, Alabama, where Sims says, I had a little hospital built for myself. Right? And I didn't just, I write history, not creative fables and tales, right? I don't have time for it. You all heard how many jobs I have. I'm just saying, library, company, Queens College, active public speaking career. I don't have time to make these things up, right? I'm literally using what he said. So how do you just forget Alabama in the 1840s and 10 years later, now you have the first hospital for the treatment of women in New York? Really? No. So once again, right, you have a erasure, right? There's an erasure of blackness that starts to happen, right? And this is now where I'm not going to use theoretical language, I only say that for academic conferences, right? Where you use a word with maybe 3 syllables that people don't know, and then they proclaim you brilliant. So I will not do that here because it is just about posturing. But this is where I am going to put the theory into praxis, right? So when I talk about the archives erasing black women, it's complicated because the language used in the articles that comprise the archives is very explicit. Sims, Matar, Cuvier, McDowell, they all talk about their Negro patients or negresses. The language is very clear. Look at the image. And if you don't pay attention, often when you flip through pictures, right? You can flip through the newspaper, I promise you, even in liberal Portland, I promise you, you might see a picture that says, African-American father, walking his son to school. The next page, children playing outside, the school, because the normal children don't need a racial descriptor, right? This is not people just being intentionally racist. They're also inheriting a cultural practice around race that normalizes whiteness and erases everybody else, right? So you have these 19th century medical journal articles that talk about these women. In fact, sometimes they'll say, negress owned by X, Y, and Z. But the images are not of black women, right? So all of a sudden, Sims has this fully clothed patient whose body is cut off. You only see her, as he writes, her nates or her buttocks. In fact, the white nurse is the one who is inserting the speculum and touching her buttocks, where Sims kind of observes. She even has on nice shoes, right? And so all of a sudden, the image doesn't correspond with the language. Remember racial cognitive dissonance? I'm just saying, right? I'm not making this up. Guess what? Nathan Bozeman, one of the former surgical assistants who left Sims, who becomes his most vocal critic, he then begins a very successful gynecological practice. He writes about his reparative surgery on vesicovaginal fistula. He talks about his slave patient, Matilda Stamper. Now, at least he's a bit more honest, right? Because Stamper is fully nude. But Stamper almost looks like she's asleep. It's so it's just painless, it's peaceful. And don't get me wrong, I am not saying they are not white-appearing black people. I'm married to one. People see us, I always introduce him as my faux white man. I'm just joking, but he does look like a faux white man, right? He has the blackest voice in the world, but looks as white as his mama, bless his heart. And so I understand that there are very light-skinned black people, but all of them in the medical journals? I mean, I don't have on my glasses, but I can look around the room and see black people without my glasses on, right? How is it in the medical journals when it's about gynecology, all of a sudden, the images don't match the descriptive language of who they are? It's an erasure in the archives. So if you encounter the archives and visually what you see is an erasure where even blackness becomes whiteness, right? And normalized, people then don't associate this with the institution of slavery. Slavery then becomes just agricultural. Slavery becomes just about cotton. And you don't see the kind of pioneering work that's happening with enslaved bodies, dead and alive, right? Remember, Georges Cuvier and the kind of value that Sarty Bartman's cadaver held for him. Ephraim McDowell and the grave robbing, right? Which was a practice throughout the South, right? And the value of even black slaves in the afterlife of slavery, right? And so now by the antebellum era, you have an erasure of the black woman's image in medical literature. And so this is where I'm going to kind of end it neatly and then take your questions. So at least I can write, I mean, I have 20-something pages here and I've not read one word off of the page. So let me just end by saying, right, gynecological surgeons during the early and mid-19th century were neither exceptionally cruel nor sadistic physicians who enjoyed butchering black women's bodies, as some scholars have argued. Who they were elite white men who lived in an era where scientific racism flourished. Ideas about black inferiority were established and widely believed as underlying assumptions held about black people, right? Not experiencing pain, being immodest, those kinds of things, having different anatomical, a kind of different anatomical composition than white people. Black women were a vulnerable population that doctors used because of easier accessibility to their bodies. Further, the value of black women's reproductive labor demanded that it be fixed when it was seen as broken by those who depended upon their labor. As elite medical men like James Marion Sims and his colleagues met the demands of clinical practice and those of clinical investigation, they were confronted with the challenges of observing black women's lives, most of whom were mothers that existed somewhere between humanity and science. And so I always end with saying that literally you have American gynecology being birthed in the wombs of enslaved women. Thank you. I welcome your comments and your questions.
Hi. Please raise your hand very high. I don't have my glasses on, so. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering what your opinion is on continuing to preserve and display artifacts that make up a part of our historical fabric, but at the same time perpetuate a racist paradigm?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's really interesting because there are moments now in obviously the 20th and the 21st century where, people give consent or families give consent. I tend to have an issue with the display of especially oppressed people's bodies and their remains in these spaces of learning where there is no acknowledgement about how those bodies and those remains were obtained. So, I remember on my honeymoon, we went to, this sounds like the nerdiest honeymoon ever, but we went to London, and of course, I wanted to see the British Museum. Judge me. So we go, and I'm having a great time until literally I enter the busiest part of the museum. If any of you all have ever been there, the kind of Egypt display, and this is when King Tut there was like this special exhibit. But in the middle, and I don't know what it's like now. I've been back to London a few times. I've not been to the British Museum, at least to that area since. But in the middle of the floor was Cleopatra's tomb. And I remember thinking, what if this were my grandmother, right? Or my grandfather? Like, would I want their tomb in the middle of a space where people are taking selfies? There is something about that, or even the kind of controversy around the Paris Museum not wanting to send the remains back to South Africa because of this belief that perhaps they did not know how to take care of the remains. Like, I lived in South Africa. I didn't want to come back to Georgia, right? I mean, the infrastructure was wonderful. Now, did it have challenges? Yes. But to assume that there is not, right, a professional population of people in this really populous African nation who won't know how to treat, right, a woman who comes from that region, her remains with respect, as if somehow they know how to do better. And I remember one South African was like, but you all lost her genitalia. You don't even have it. Like, we're not going to lose her skeleton. In fact, we're going to bury it. We're going to perform, our proper memorialization of her skeleton. So those kinds of issues that always deal with this kind of hierarchy about who knows best and who should be the guardians, I think they should be sent back. I mean, I really do. I think they need to be sent back, or there needs to be some kind of recognition of how those remains were obtained, really stolen, in many cases.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
My name is Emmanuel Harris. I am a freshman psych major here at Lewis and Clark. My question is, as someone who's listened to, for me, who has listened to The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and you can see a much more closer timeline. How do you see with going back with the history of the medical system and having now where there's a mass majority of people who can't get health care, who are the descendants of these people who were studied to then build these institutions? How do you feel about things like that?
Oh, I have lots of feelings, Emmanuel, but I will try to focus here. So a part of my wanting to really talk about this late 18th century and 19th century history is to let people know that everything didn't just happen in the 20th and the 21st centuries. And also it emerged out of my own anger about my ignorance about this moment in our country's history. I think, like many of you, I had not heard of Henrietta Lacks actually until after I had obtained my PhD. It was with Rebecca Skloutz's book. I had heard kind of remnants of the story, but didn't know her name. I knew about HeLa cells. That was the extent of my knowledge until the book came out. I had only heard about Tuskegee, and then I heard about the birth control experiments on Puerto Rican women, right? So I remember having a kind of particular animus that I was ignorant, because as, I can't remember if it was Maya or Jasmine, I went to 2 HBCUs. And one of them is the country's oldest black women's college. So I'm like, how in the world did I not know this going to Bennett College? How do I have a master's degree in African American studies? Medicine was never discussed. My mother has a BS in professional biology. I call her and she's like, no, baby, I just heard a Tuskegee. So that's when I knew. I was just like, okay, I know that there's something there. And then when I started to scratch the surface, I'm like, none of this is new. Like, none of this is new, right? And there are folk who have gone as far back as the 17th century in Europe, right? Londa Scheenbinger is one of those researchers whose work I greatly admire, and you start to see the ways in which these kinds of practices have been passed down through time, right? They might have been refined due to the era, but they've been passed down and they've been perfected. And so here we are in the 21st century, and you have spaces, once again, I'll be autobiographical. I am from literally the blackest and the poorest county in the state of South Carolina. It's called Williamsburg County. And when I was in high school, I graduated high school in 1990. By the time I graduated, Williamsburg County, which had once been a bustling county in the state of South Carolina during the antebellum era, in fact, so bustling that I graduated from a high school across from a cotton field. Our mascot was called the Golden Boll Weevil, because of the kind of ferocity of the boll weevil to destroy cotton crops. So seriously, I was a cheerleader. We talked about the mighty golden boll weevils, but I digress. So by 1990, we did not have an OBGYN ward at our hospital. So if you were a pregnant person, you had to go to typically Florence County, Georgetown County, maybe an hour to Charleston, to have a baby. By the time I graduated college and moved and worked for a few years, the only midwife had died. It has remained that way until the 21st century. All right? So in freedom, it seems, Black women's reproduction is not valued in the same way that it was in slavery. Because what is the economic benefit of having a lot of Black children that are now seen as economic burdens? So in the 21st century, right, all of a sudden you don't have women who are called breeders. And by slave owners and overseers, breeders are seen as a kind of special category of women who can create wealth. You now have baby mamas and welfare queens who create an economic burden on society. And so I often talk about the kind of matter of Black lives in the 19th century with the economic, right, figure written beside it as being much more, it was a much more kind of racially integrative process. We had Black and white people concerned with Black women's reproduction and the ability to maintain it and preserve it. That is not necessarily the case in the 21st century. And so then what is the legacy of that? In the 21st century, morbidity rates for mothers and infants in the Black community, let's not even talk about the Native community, right? Because people don't even keep those figures. But in the Black community in particular, rival the 19th century. And often people will think I'm being hyperbolic. I'm like, if you don't believe me, you can Google it. As many of my students like to fact check as I'm lecturing, right? I'm like, Google it. You'll see I'm not making this up. The morbidity rates are the same during the time of Sims, Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, as it is today. That's the legacy.
I just had a question about what it means for you to be a revisionist historian and
What kind of historian? I can't.
a revisionist historian and how it works like in that community as a Black woman. How do you experience like inequalities in that community?
It is, I mean, people are really positive, which is, you know, for me, it's a great thing to kind of be able to have conversations with people in academic settings, but also in community settings about an era of American history where I have essentially dedicated my life, right? I mean, all of my jobs are centered around the past and telling these stories that people don't know. And so it has been receptive. The only push, and I wouldn't even say it was pushback, it was just kind of a I think a kind of disapproval of what I was saying was by one of the activists in New York. I did a lot, as you might imagine, a lot of panels, a lot of kind of community group meetings. And most activists were like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. I really thought Sims was trying to destroy these women's reproduction because of XYZ book I read, you know, and I'm like, was the person actually a historian, right? And that doesn't mean other people can't write about this, but I'm like, there's a particular way that historians are trained to use the tools of our trade. And so one activist, I remember, was just bothered by that because she wanted the narrative to be that Sims was, in fact, butchering these women. And so my thing is, for 5 years of experimentation that had largely been based on failed experiments, the intention, his intention might not have been to butcher, but clearly there is damage being done, right? So in no way am I taking that away. But he is also occupied with his own impending status, right? If he damages them, he then has to pay these owners back more than what he bargained for, more than what he originally owed. He's also stopping the promulgation of slavery in a very localized way. And so she had an issue with that. I remember, and she brought up this man, I don't want to say his name because y'all told me this might be live streamed, but we had lunch, and he's a journalist, and he's writing a book called Anarchist Quest. I'll just say that. And it's a lot of speculative history, but people who write about dead people use a lot of speculative history, particularly when that dead community of historical actors could not write. They didn't leave written records. So notice, everything I said was literally my interpretation of what white men wrote about these women. You rarely get their words. And so I remember she said, well, he said that, you know, Sims did this and this. And I said, I know who you're talking about. And he also told me he wants to get a movie deal like Rebecca Sklootz did. Right? So all I can say is most people, except that one person, they are grateful for it. And the wonderful thing is I've been allowed to be in conversation and share space with artists and activists and medical practitioners where we're now at the table to talk about the ways that we can have a corrective around the kind of fraught medical legacy of racialized science and racist medical practice. I'm going to end this very long answer by just saying, if most of you have the time, just, you know, you can Google the various medical studies that have come out. UVA is one. They did a study in 2014. It was published in 2016, where essentially medical students and residents were being taught that there was a distinct biological difference between black and white patients, that black people did not experience pain, that black people's blood was thicker, that black people's skin was thicker. And so what is the kind of consequence of that? Black patients come in who are experiencing pain. It could be sickle cell, it could be kidney stones, and they are not given the medicine to relieve themselves of pain. Or they're not believed because the assumption is perhaps they are heavy drug users. Right? And so those are the kinds of things that, for me, I can now sit at the table with a medical college professor, with someone in medical humanities, with a doula, with a midwife, and think about the ways that we can come together collectively to try to stop that kind of misinformation about human beings, right? And the kind of racialized medicine that does not need to be practiced.
Any other questions?
One woman over there, yeah.
This is kind of going back to what you're talking about with revisionist history, but it was when you were talking about when you were at the National Archives and how you were kind of comparing between sources. And I was wondering if you had any ideas about how we could make those forms of research more accessible
those forms of research, you said? So thank you for asking me this question. Now I can use this little term that all of my colleagues think is so smart. And I'm like, I promise you all, I didn't invent it. So I think about the haptic. If you now look on your smartphones, it's like sounds and haptic. I didn't know what that word meant until like a year and a half ago, right? But it's about the kind of handling and the manipulation of objects, right, and touch. So it's about kind of sensory knowledge, tactile knowledge. And there is something about going in the archives where I think we should be looking for sensory knowledge and tactile knowledge. So for instance, with this kind of work that I do, and in this particular kind of research, people are always asking, how can you tell these stories? Wasn't that book hard to write? Right? They're often thinking about the kind of emotional labor that goes into doing this kind of history on slavery, but also bodies in pain. I'm not talking about healthy people, right? I'm talking about ill people. And so for me, it is about thinking about the archives differently, where that doesn't mean you let go of the tools of history or sociology or anthropology or archaeology, but you use your own kind of tactile knowledge and sensory knowledge to help you process how to do the work. So when I first began archival research, I remember, there were obviously there was kind of digitization of sources, but it wasn't as common, 14, 15 years ago. And I remember going to the Caroliniana Library at the University of South Carolina and just going through the boxes, and they're dusty. And, sometimes you touch the paper and it like literally crumble in your hands. And I just remember seeing some names that seemed really familiar to me. And my mother is kind of the family genealogist. And so I remember calling her at one point, and I said, I started naming these names. And she said, oh, yeah, those are the people who owned our ancestors. And side note, my family has literally been on both sides in South Carolina since it was a British colony, since the 18th century. We've been in the same two colonies for a really, really long time. And I just remember not knowing the language. I didn't have the language then, but every time I would go through a box, I would go and wash my hands. Until the 3 or 4 week trip, my hands were cracked and bleeding because I washed them so much, right? Now I recognize this kind of response I had to the hapticity of the archives, right? And what that did to me. And so often enslaved people would talk about a kind of soul care or a laying on of the hands. And so for me, right, it allowed me to think about also the work that someone who is a researcher, who is a historian, also must do in telling these stories. Because enslaved people, like many vulnerable folk, right, whether you're talking about people who were in asylums or orphanages or even prisons, they don't want the interiority of their lives exposed. And here I am, I just spoke for an hour about the most intimate parts of their lives to you all. And this is not what they would have wanted, right? And so I have to be able to kind of suss that out and figure out what it means. And so I am now in a process of doing kind of a side project about hapticity and slavery and the history of medicine, because it really is about the kind of explicit handling and manipulation of the body, right? Bodies that were considered objects, not necessarily subjects. And so, this is the kind of intellectual process and project that I'm going through, but also trying to embark upon and think about very seriously, because it is hard to do this kind of work and remain detached. And I just think that is, in a very real sense, a very Eurocentric and a very masculinist way of doing history that is not a healthy and wholesome way of doing history. And we can actually do it differently and better, I think, because it's a more honest approach to doing history.
Thank you.
Okay. Is that it? It looks like that might be it. All right.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and please attend the next events.